Hi, I'm Emma and this is Rob, and we want to welcome you back for episode 3 of Hope and the City. And in this episode, we're looking at what does hope mean? What is hope? And we start to unpack it, look at it, discuss kind of different ways that we found hope and actually practical things that we can do to keep feeding that hope that we have.
We're taking on really from where we were in episode 1, talking about your story and how you've used journaling, how particular relationships have been so important to you during these tough times. But I think actually this episode is relevant to all the things we're talking about. Actually, these are practical things that whether you are struggling with grief, whether actually it's addiction, whether actually you're just someone going through the grind of life, what are some things you can do to keep the fire burning, keep the hope alive? So we hope you find this episode helpful. Again, as always, if anything comes up for you in this that's either personal and you want to interact with us on email, we'll be on hope@crplymouth.co.uk. If you've got some ideas for new episodes we could be taking on, we've got some guests coming on. Please interact with us with your comments as well on the socials, which is at Hope and the City Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, etc. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Last week, you asked me before we came on air, you said, you talked about your faith quite a lot last week. And in your testimony, you talked about your faith. And we talked about it in terms of being held by God, who we referred to as Father. Sometimes we referred to him as our shepherd. Sometimes we talk about his son, Jesus, who actually rose from the dead, who gave us this hope. So we talk a lot about God and hope.
Yes.
But I guess the question you asked me offline, and I'm now processing it as we talk and we can process it together, is, but what do we do in those times? So this has been a mixed bag of a week for you. You're going to have a tricky afternoon. What do we do in preparation for those times? What do we do to go through those chapters of life that feel particularly heavy? It's not simply waiting for God and saying, when's he next going to give me that bit of peace? When's he next going to lift me up like he did before? There's a level of investment from my side that puts me in as, and perhaps you can say from your side, and with as good a chance as any to get some perspective back, to just to get through that day.
Yeah, I totally get that. I mean, one of the things that I think about is while we are thinking about the lost one, the loved one that we've lost to death there, actually there's a life for us to be living alongside that. And we want to acknowledge the loss of the loved one, and we want to feel that sadness. And it's right that we do feel that sadness, but in it, we are still living. And I don't mean that in a glib way at all, but I think we can honour those people with our lives.
That's interesting. I'm sorry to cut across you there, but I obviously spend a lot of my time in North Plymouth and on the estates and things. And when I hang out in the cafes, when I talk to people, so often, there's a straight talking nature to Plymouth, but people say something like, she wouldn't want to see you like this.
Yeah.
I find that so interesting. And obviously there's an appropriate time to say things like this. I think when you watch someone that actually you care about wallow for too long, is that a crude or a cruel thing to say?
Yeah, I think, we mentioned it, I think, in the first episode as well. We talked about the importance of relationship.
You know when to say the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you were talking about humour, I think, then. Yes. When is it okay to roll out a little bit of dark humour? Because sometimes it is appropriate and it is a good pressure release, really. So, and I think, again, with this, it has to be out of relationship and out of a deep conversation of saying, you have the gift of life. A friend of mine worked in an intensive care unit for years, and she was there during COVID in the front line, and I think it was very harrowing for all of the staff.
I can imagine.
Involved in all of those frontline ministries or those frontline occupations. And she said she turned 50 not long after, and she said, I owe my 50th birthday as a tribute to those people who didn't make it to 50. And she said, I'm going to celebrate big because I want to, I've got this gift of life.
Yes.
And I think it is seeing it like a gift.
I can honour them by living the life that I do have.
Yeah. And certainly I can relate to that, with my own experience of losing James at such a young age, my son. I can relate to that actually not a lot, but some of what I do I think, do you know what? His life, he was taken at the age of 21. You know, I'm now 49, as of my birthday yesterday. I'm now 49. Actually, I still have, hopefully still have years ahead of me, and I live in this moment. So, yeah, thinking that nothing's guaranteed, but equally that there's things that I can be doing right now.
I think there's a difference between saying you're dishonouring them by being sad, but on the other side, it's you're not honouring them by being glum for the rest of your life.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's probably more the latter statement that gets slightly closer to the truth. Yeah. Now, coming back to this idea of practical things that you've done, we mentioned in the first episode that you kept a blog up until the time that James passed away. You also write things down for yourself in a journal. You've bought some of your journals. You were late this morning, but actually not later than me. But you were digging these out of your cupboards or what have you.
Yeah.
Why did you feel the need to do that? And can you just explain a bit about journaling and how that's helped you with this hopeful journey through grief?
Yeah. So the journaling actually has become really important. And I would probably count the blog as a type of journaling.
Okay,
actually.
so journaling's just simply writing down your thoughts. Is that simply
absolutely, absolutely. And we talked about the blog back in the first episode.
We did.
And I said how useful it was to help clarify my thoughts, get them in order, especially when you've had a discussion with a doctor and they give you like a lot of information and you just need to like order it in your mind. Really, I found the blog really useful for that, and as other family members did as well. And then the journaling, I mean, it's something like you hear in Christian circles used quite a lot, doesn't it? People talk about journaling.
But people keep diaries. Yeah. All kinds of people keep diaries, don't they?
And also, I think in counselling, I think they encourage people to journal because it's almost like that letter that you don't send where you can just spill everything that you're feeling onto paper. And actually, it just does help with that whole process. So I've always been a big journaler. As you can see, this is just like the 6 months, I think, leading up to James's.
Well, there's a few books for people who can't see. There's quite a few books on the desk there.
Yeah.
But one of the things you mentioned to me outside as you're getting your coffee was that actually there was a strange silence in your journaling for a week.
Yeah, for like 6 days. So I was just looking back and I noticed I journal in July right up until James passes away, and then he passed away on the 24th of July, and my next entry is on the 30th of July, which interestingly was like I had no words. I just could not even, I don't think, string words together to be able to write down. Such was the numbness and the pain of losing James. You know, we talk about the hope, and we talked last week about hope isn't based on outcomes, but there was such...
That was the worst that could happen in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think even though towards the end, the last few days, we knew what was coming, there's the actual bit where your heart catches up with your head. Like what your eyes have seen, your heart has to comprehend is real. And I think in those 6 days, that was perhaps all of it, you know, just trying to get our head around. I mean, it's a busy time as well. You're expected to make big decisions, but I think the numbness and the silence. But interestingly, as I'm reading this, I've put James passed away on Sunday the 24th.
This is your first now entry after that period of silence. Sorry.
Yeah. So James passed away on Sunday the 24th of July at 9 p.m. I've known you there in the pain of the lost, Lord. I know that you're carrying us. I thank you for your comfort and assurance, and I thank you where James is. I'm sorry that I haven't really been able to speak to you or write to you this last week. You're the only one who knows where I am. And thank you that you provide the people that surround us. And I think I was saying to you, wasn't I, as I read through the journal, actually, one of my big thank you prayers is for the people that God placed around us at that time, that were the physical hands and feet through our pain. They were the physical presence of an invisible God. And that's how he used people to reach us. One
of the other things that you've put, you shared with me, I don't know where it is in your journal, but probably quite soon after this period of silence, you also prayed or expressed in your journal your desire that the people around you would not stop talking about James.
Yeah. So the next paragraph, actually, from what I just read, says, just praying that after all of this, that in our talking, people won't forget to mention James. Please, Lord, let them honour him. I want everyone to hear his name. I don't want him to be forgotten. And just really powerful words, you know, just that desire that his life should be meaningful, that it should be marked somewhere and not just like the dust blown away. And then, the bigger the impact that person has on your life, I think the stronger those feelings are. So we all know distant people, or we've heard about people that have passed away, and time rolls on and their memory dims a little bit. But for those of us that had somebody really close that's been lost, that never happens.
No.
That never happens. That, like I said earlier, didn't I, all those stages of grief, I think I have most days, and some more extreme than another. I mean, one of the things I do remember doing after James died, I couldn't sleep. And I think I perhaps had a little bit of like a PTSD, and I'm not just a touch of it where I couldn't sleep, because when I tried to close my eyes at night, all I could see was James's face, really. And it was harrowing. It was really harrowing. And I remember I was like, Lord, how can I get through this stage? I was praying that, Lord, how can I get through this stage? And I felt like he pointed me to Psalm 23. Now, I've heard Psalm 23 loads of times. And
the Lord is my shepherd.
And lots of people, whether they're believers or non-believers.
I'm not religious, but
but
I know Psalm 23, even if it's Vicar of Dibley.
Following different faiths, I think people are. Shall I just read it?
It's amazing. Please do.
Shall I just read it while we're here? So this is Psalm 23, and it says, "The Lord is my shepherd; I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley," and in some versions that says the valley of the shadow of death, "I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And I have to say, when I think back to those early weeks after losing James, actually having heard this, then I read this and I felt like I was living it. Because even going back to the very first, which says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing," it's like everything else in my world was completely rocked and nothing made any kind of sense anymore. And even as I spoke to other people, I felt like I was behind a glass window, like the world was going on and I was like behind this glass window, unable to connect with it. And the Lord is my shepherd. And despite being behind the glass, my true north was God, and I had to stay focused on
So he was
the
the constant thing that you recognised when everything else was beginning to look different. You were feeling different, people responding to you different. There was a constant.
Yes, absolutely. And the
North Star.
Yeah, absolutely. He was that place that I could go, that unchanging, that one thing, that one person that was unchanging in a very precarious time.
It's interesting you say it as well, Emma, because actually the first 6 days you said nothing, not only in your journal, but in your journal you reveal you said nothing to God. But the kind of God we're talking about is happy with you not saying anything. And last week on the podcast you say how one of the outcomes of going through grief is your increased ability to sit with people and say nothing. So in one way you're beginning through the suffering. We said last week, suffering produces perseverance, which develops a kind of character that brings hope. Your character has been shaped in this. And the hope can just sit there in the silence. But you're able to be that hope, that hopeful silence for people.
It's a visible representation, like I said earlier, of an invisible God, isn't it? That the invisible God who's with us at all times is listening. And by them being the physical person that can represent God, we're able to listen in.
And just by sitting there and being there. Because one of the things, as you're talking, we're thinking about the practical things we've been doing, reminding ourselves of things that are true. The Bible for me is the ultimate source of, it's the anchor, it's the truth, it never changes. And Psalm 23 is a great place for people to go. We've talked about journaling. But coming back to relationships and having people around you, you use the word safety. We used it last week as well, and trust. And I think there's people, I'm sort of riffing a bit here, but there's people that generally we really trust.
Yes.
And we would trust them with, we'd drop the kids around and leave the kids there. We'd trust them with money. We'd trust them to keep a secret. But there are also some people with whom, in these particularly vulnerable moments, we feel safe.
Yes. Yes.
And I can think of people in my life who I really trust. They're trustworthy, but I'm not necessarily sure I'd feel safe enough with them in those most fragile moments. And I think that's just a discernment thing for us as we go through difficult times. I think safe for me is that people bring up stuff at my speed.
Yes. And they ask the right questions.
And they ask the right questions to work out if you're okay with that.
Yeah. And they're not afraid. You can, it's in people's non-verbals as well, isn't it? It's not just in their verbal responses, but in their non-verbals. Are they comfortable? Do they look comfortable when you bring up the subject? And death is a very, not everybody is comfortable with talking about that, are they? With the end of life and the loss of, and the pain of death. And I think actually to know a bit of their backstory as well, because actually most people that are good at listening have a bit of a backstory. And it doesn't have to be around death, but they've either spent years perhaps in a caring profession or counselling or something else. And I would say some trusted listening service, I think, would be the way to say it. And I would, and also those, for me, because I'm a person of faith, I've got friends who I really trust as well, who aren't Christians. But my friends that are Christians know me at a much deeper level because there's an element of my life that they understand that perhaps people who don't believe.
It's interesting. So Christianity as a religion, and I'm not a fan of religion, gets a bad rap, and sometimes for the right reasons. And there's many things that I'm slightly embarrassed about when it comes to church and religion and various things. First of all, we've got to remember we don't have a religious God. Secondly, we've got to remember that his son Jesus, when he came, the only people he got angry with were not the people who were struggling with life, but with the people who made faith so complicated that those people who were struggling couldn't access it. So we don't have a religious God. But it is interesting that actually people have approached me, not because I'm a vicar, but because they know I have a faith. And I think they see me as a safe person because of that. Not necessarily people who'd call themselves Christians. And I've also picked up on Facebook, I lost a friend a few months ago. And one of the things, he went through a very difficult time the year before he passed away. And during that time, he came and drew particularly close, not to the church as an organised thing. He didn't suddenly turn up on Sundays. I'm not that interested in that, really. But he drew particularly close to a couple of Christian friends, me and another good friend of mine, Russ. And I thought that's interesting, that he thought that was a safe place he could go.
Also, I wonder if it's because you represent hope as well, because you have faith, and he knows, presumably, that you have a faith, that within that you represent a hope as well.
He was a person who said, Rob, I'm not religious, but I want you to take my mum's funeral. And I still hear those words in my head all the time. I'm not religious, but, and I think that's fine.
But he was looking for hope, wasn't he? He wanted hope.
And he thought he could find it among us. Perhaps that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
So we've talked about journaling. We've talked about having some truth, some nuggets of truth. I think some people have the footprints in the sand poem in their bathrooms at home. I think that's... it's not direct words from the Bible, but it's total Bible, isn't it? It's really Psalm 23, isn't it? I'm, for I know you're with me.
The thing is as well, like these verses here, I think before, I always thought they were very wise. There was real wisdom in these words, but I think in the deepest grief, actually, I was living those words. Do you know what I mean? I was absolutely, that was a description of my life that I was... I needed to lie down. So, for example...
You needed to lie down. Be restored.
So I've said before, I was working at Plymouth Christian Centre in the office there, the staff team, and I took some months out initially after James died. And I went back thinking I was ready and just so desperately trying to hold on to something that was normal and that would resemble something of my life before James died. And they were so good. They were just like, let us look after you. No pressure on you to do anything. Just let us care for you. But I very strongly felt God in around the October, November time say, you need to step aside and come and lie down with me in the green pastures. And I did. And actually it was such a restorative time. So I think I was off from mid-November to like mid-February. And yeah, the Lord just restored me. And I can't say restored me to before, because I think when you've been through that kind of experience, there is no going back to who you were before, but he restored me to who could make me for the rest, to go forward from that place onwards, really. So
I remember as well that Carl's employer had been great during a lot of that time. And so we're not here to say, the Christians are the helpful people. No. It's not about the ins and outs and that religious language. We're not interested in that. But actually hope and kindness can come from anywhere.
Yes.
And perhaps someone listening is an employer. You can be a big part in somebody's journey of grief.
Well, even thinking about our Tom. So our Tom's like 25. And of course, at the time he was 23, works as a welder. And his company were just great. They just wrapped around him. They gave him, how can I put it, like light tasks. So I don't mean physically light tasks, but I mean ones that didn't put him in. So he goes up roofs and all that kind of thing, like doing welding and scaffolding and things. So they didn't put him like on a high rise, or they didn't put him in a position where he had to think deeply about something, problem solve or whatever. They gave him much more mundane tasks, I think, to do so that he could be physically present, even if he wasn't emotionally and mentally present. And that was just, they were just amazing. They just loved on him as well. And so Tom's employers, Carl's employers were amazing. Just gave us the space that we needed. But it very much goes back to he makes me lie down in green pastures and he leads me beside quiet waters. And it says here, he refreshes my soul. And I'm sure in other versions it says he restores my soul. And that very much was that experience. I mean, during that time, I did quite a bit of reading as well. And I read a book by Malcolm Duncan called Good Grief, which I highly recommend. And in the first half of the book, Malcolm Duncan talks about his own experience of loss. And he's had a tremendous amount of loss in his family, young, old, expected, unexpected. And his reality and his grittiness of saying he was getting on a ferry, I think, at one point, and one of his parents had passed away, and he parked the car and he got out and he just laid down on the tarmac because he just couldn't move, curled up in a ball, because he was so overcome with grief. And it just all of a sudden made me feel like it's okay to feel this way. It was just such a breakthrough that actually I'm not abnormal. It's not that I'm not coping with life, but it is that I'm overwhelmed with grief, which was just so powerful. But in the second half of his book, he talks about Lazarus. And and as he explained it, I heard it in such a different way. And he talked about how so in the story of Lazarus, so Lazarus and Mary and Martha,
they're all friends of Jesus.
And they call for Jesus to come and heal Lazarus because he's sick, but Jesus doesn't. He stays continuing doing what he's doing where he's doing, and he comes a few days later, by which time Lazarus has passed away and he's been gone for a couple of days. So they've put him in a tomb, and Jesus arrives and he grieves with the sisters. And even though he knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, he actually grieves with the sisters. And I think it's that point that really spoke to me as well, is, that Jesus grieves with us. God grieves with us. He grieves over our broken hearts, because this was never his intention for us to experience death. He wants us to have eternal life. And we were never originally, back with Adam and Eve, meant to experience the pain of death, were we?
And coming back to Psalm 23, though I walk through the darkest valley, is in the middle of that psalm, isn't it? And at the end, you can prepare a feast for me, my cup's going to be overflowing, and all those things. But it's going through those dark times is a hope. And one of the things that made me think of was an analogy that you mentioned. I don't know if it came from that book, but that grief is like turning your back on the waves. So you've been at Cornwall this weekend. I went down to Bute 2 weeks ago. North Coast, the waves are just different up there. You're getting smashed. So I was trying to keep my eyes on the waves because, and also on my 10-year-old who just wanted to jump around in them, and I was worried she'd get totally smashed. Explain this analogy of having your back to the waves and grief.
Yeah, well, somebody once said to me, and I can't remember where it came from or whether I read it, but it said grief being like standing in the sea with your back to the waves, and while you think you've managed to get yourself to a place of functioning, and where you can actually perform daily tasks and live a little, again, actually, it feels like out of nowhere come these big waves and they knock you off your feet, and you never know when they're coming. So when you're stood with the back to the waves, they just knock you, don't they? And it reminded me, we went, Abby and I, my daughter Abby and I went not swimming, dipping I would say. Dipping this weekend twice actually, and I was reminded of that. But then somebody else also said to me, sometimes we can make moments to embrace our grief and feel our pain, like we said, with the right person, maybe a conversation or
an event.
Or an event.
Going to get a few people together on an anniversary and allow yourself to
those spaces of grief. And actually, it feels like you are able to invite grief in on your terms. So one of the things we were talking about just before we went on air about the waves, and we were saying about almost inviting the grief in means that you're able to turn around and face the wave as it comes, which means you can prepare for it. It doesn't take you so off guard. And I think that's true. I do think that's true, that you can face the grief sort of almost more head on, really, than if you're not preparing for it, if you're not embracing it, if you're not allowing yourself to feel it, and if you're locking it away, that's when it comes unexpectedly. But there will still be waves that catch you.
And there's also life that you need to crack on with, as we said at the beginning. So you can't constantly face that wave because you've got a 10-year-old
to make sure.
10-year-old to make sure they're not drowning.
Yeah, absolutely those things. But they still do catch you. So it will be the sight of a jumper in a supermarket, a man wearing a jumper in a supermarket, or the back of a head that looks like somebody, and that will be the wave that is unexpected. So you can almost face the waves when it comes to like anniversaries or special occasions. And yes, it does feel sad and it does rub and hurt. Like I said back at the beginning, everything feels a little bit incomplete still without James. It's just 2 years. But actually you can learn to invite, a certain amount of grief in and prepare for it. But then other areas you won't. It will just take you like a curved ball. And you won't be able to.
And this man in this book, which sounds so good. Remind us of the title of the book.
So it's called Good Grief.
Good Grief by
Malcolm Duncan.
And he just curled up as a fetus on the tarmac.
Yeah, he talks about lots of different scenarios. He had like a nephew and then the nephew's father. So the nephew died and then the father just really struggled, couldn't get past the grief, and then he took his life. And just so many different types of grief, so many different scenarios, ages of people that have died, different circumstances. And
the book's practical as well as
but
real.
Hopeful. That's the thing. The thing, you would think it would feel quite down, wouldn't you? Do you know what I mean? On that subject. But actually, he just offers a hope and that reassurance that you're normal to feel those things. So that was really valuable. I mean, one of the other things as well that we did was the bereavement journey.
Okay.
Which is run by HDB.
So someone can go Google HDB bereavement journey. I know from a little bit about the content that actually the first 6 weeks is talking about all these pains, the reality of it. And they're quite open to say, look, we do want to end up talking about our hope in God at the end, but this is a space for everybody. And then there's some additional episodes, if you like, at the end for people who want to go deep into faith. This isn't about Bible bashing. It's creating the space, being real, meeting other people in a similar situation. But what is so interesting, and we don't have much more time actually today. I thought we'd run out of things to say. We never do ever. It's that actually I'm often surprised when I ask someone, would you like me to pray for you? That regardless of what anyone would say about their background, their faith or whatever, very rarely do people turn around and say no. And it reminds me of a conversation I had a few years ago with some friends of mine, multi-generational family. It's a single dad, a younger child, and then a gran, and they live together. And the gran, who I know well, and I was chatting to her, she'd lost her husband quite a young age. Then she was born, her son was born heavily disabled, so she was a carer for him. Right. And then he was abused as part of people who were looking after him. And then apparently never got over that, and then he died. I mean, it's one of those stories where again and again talk about the waves coming in and just smashing you in life. And we had a frank conversation, and in relationships sometimes when you can say something, I wanted her to have as much space as possible to wallow, to be honest with me about how she felt. And then she said, I'm not quite sure about all this God stuff. And obviously she felt she could say that to me. And I just felt a prompt from God to actually undergird her a little bit and say, you know what? I'll be honest with you because I love you. I don't think it helps you if you take God out of the equation.
Oh, wow.
And I wouldn't, I'm not always, people know me, I'm not a Bible basher in that sense, but sometimes I get a prompt from the Lord that this is what she needs, otherwise she's going to fall too far. And I said, no, it doesn't help. I said, if we take God out of the equation, there's no heaven. That doesn't help your husband or your son, but also if you take away God, there's no justice for the perpetrators against your son as well.
Yes.
And I think in love, we need to be honest with people. I don't know who's in heaven and who's not. That's not my decision. That's God's decision. I know he's made a way through his son for us to be forgiven, who, a bit like me, have strayed.
Bit like all of us.
We've all strayed. That's what the Bible says. Actually, none of us are perfect. And we say that, don't we? We've all fallen short. We're not perfect. But he's made a way for us to be forgiven and to be there. But some people, to the bitter end, will just refuse to be there. But our confidence about heaven is ultimately, without God, there is no heaven. Without Jesus rising from the dead, none of us will. So let's not remove God from this situation. And let's not remove justice from the conversation. I know people don't like talking about hell as well as heaven. And again, it's not my place to say who goes where. But we believe in justice. And heaven isn't just an eternal replay of this earth. I mean, that wouldn't be heaven, would it?
No.
Because this place is a mess. And actually, God said it would be. And I think often people say, I don't like talking about God because the world's such a mess. I said, that's not a reason not to believe in God. That's a reason to believe in God. First and foremost, because in the Bible, he said it's going to get worse. As people turn away, we make a mess. He's given us free will. He's given us choices. And the world's a mess. But what we look forward to is a time when he puts things right. He holds people to account. And as he builds this kingdom which is everlasting, going back to Psalm 23, I will live in the land of the Lord forever, in the presence of the Lord forever. It will be a feast, there'll be these things. It's because he's there. He's the king. It's not a billion little kings make up their own idea of what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. I think you used this word when you talked about your mother, one of your last conversations. Mother, you need to submit to Jesus. Need to submit. So I didn't think I'd end on that. I don't know where that came from, but we talk about the bereavement journey and how there is this optional extra to talk about faith. And whilst we want to talk about real life, we don't think it helps anyone not to talk about God.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I just think that's a really valuable point. I really do. What was it? Say it again about the.
I'm not going to say it all again. I've been rambling for the last 10 minutes.
Just that phrase that you said to
doesn't
the lady.
Help.
To remove God,
remove God from this conversation, from your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just such a powerful line, a powerful phrase. It doesn't help to remove God from your thoughts.
No.
I just think that's wonderful. Maybe that's where we should leave it.
Let's
for
leave
this
it there.
week. And we'll look forward to speaking again with you next week.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Hope and the City. We hope you found it useful and we're really glad that you've joined us. It would be great if you have any comments, any feedback, questions or anything that you'd like us to look into in the future. If you'd get in touch on
hope@crplymouth.co.uk. Actually, we're thinking about doing a whole episode dedicated to people's questions and responses to some of the things that have come up. So do interact with us. I've given the email and on the socials as well, @Hope and the City podcast. Thank you again for listening.